At the end of the Second World War, Hungary also found itself prostrate between two superpowers, but not the two superpowers envisioned during the war. In Moscow, Churchill and Stalin had sat down and worked out the percentage agreement. According to the percentage agreement, the Soviets would get 50% of Hungary and the British would get 50%. That was the idea. Because before World War II, the British had an overwhelming presence in the Mediterranean. And so they expected to be able to extend that presence up into Eastern Europe. And so Joseph Stalin went along with this. But the reality of the war changed all of it. The Soviet armies marched eastward from the farthest point of Nazi occupation. Those were hard-fought battles, and the Soviets experienced more casualties and killed more Nazis than any of the Allies combined. And so at the end of the war, Joseph Stalin disregarded this agreement and simply took control over Eastern Europe. The reality was the British had no presence in Hungary, and so Stalin had no need to keep this part of the bargain. The Allies recognized that at Yalta and agreed with him that his armies would occupy the east, Western armies would occupy the west. What is a little bit different about this story is that in 1945 there were multi-party elections. In those elections, a leftist coalition won. The communists had a part of this, the socialists had a part of this, liberal Democrats had a part of this. And so together, they formed a coalition government. No one of them alone could hope to govern. Before the elections, the communists, led by Mateusz Rákóczi, thought that they were going to be in the driver's seat. This was a partisan group that had been funded and helped by Moscow. They had hoped that their status as partisan fighters would elevate them over their election rivals in 1945. They were wrong. Voters turned to more moderate groups. And so Rákóczi and the Hungarian Communist Party joined in a coalition government. But in government, they slowly worked to undermine the stability of that democratic state. With backing from Moscow, the Hungarian Communist Party took key seats within the government and then began spreading rumors to undermine the elected government of Hungary. With fake allegations of corruption generated by Moscow, the Hungarian Communist Party was able to drive out their coalition allies, seize control, and create the People's Republic of Hungary in 1949. This was a Soviet-style communist state. The death of Stalin, however, triggered some unforeseen events. Stalin died in 1953. His successor as chairman of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was Nikita Khrushchev, 1953 to 1964. Khrushchev was a young pup compared to Stalin. He did not have the prestige or the power within the party to maintain control with an iron fist. Instead, Khrushchev used his position as party chief to try to undermine the allies of Joseph Stalin. He gave a secret speech in February of 1956. That speech detailed Stalin's crimes and the crimes of murdering millions within the Soviet Union. He denounced the tactics of Stalin and Stalinism and linked those crimes to any of Stalin's allies still within the Communist Party. Thus, Khrushchev used the secret speech to purge Stalinists and to solidify his own rule. As word of this secret speech got out, it produced economic and social unrest across Eastern Europe. There were growing cries for separation between local communist governments, local communist parties, and the Soviet Union. This reached a fever pitch in Hungary, where intellectuals, students, and writers took to the streets on the 23rd of October and demanded the downfall of the Soviet-backed government there. The street protests showed how far they were willing to go, where they cut out the Soviet emblems in the Hungarian flag. This style of art between a hammer and a piece of wheat shows the link between industrial and agricultural laborers at the heart of Soviet ideology. And so by cutting this emblem out of the Hungarian flag, these street protesters were showing that they wanted a clean break from Moscow. They even went so far as to tear down Stalin's statue. As with the Soviet Union itself, Joseph Stalin had built monuments to himself. And so the Hungarians tore down this humongous statue and then occupied the streets in defiance of Soviet guidance. The Soviet offer of assistance was rejected by Emir Nagy. Nagy rejected the offer of Soviet help. He was going to manage this domestic problem as a domestic problem and not accept Soviet interference. The Soviets, though, weren't having any of that. And so the Soviets invaded Hungary on the 4th of November to stop this insurrection in its tracks. The Soviets were not going to allow any member of the Soviet bloc to deviate from Soviet control. And so Nikita Khrushchev, who had denounced the principles of Stalinism and was trying to use that against his fellow adversaries within the Communist Party, was not about to give up the principles of Stalinism when it came to his own personal power and personal interest. He was going to maintain the Soviet bloc intact and not allow local nationalists to break away from Soviet domination. How did the United States respond? The United States obviously denounced it with words, but did nothing really more to stop it. By 1956, Eisenhower had adopted Truman's idea of resisting the spread of communism, and so the United States would provide foreign aid, foreign assistance, military assistance to try to either prop up a government against Soviet rebels, or the United States would fund a rebel movement against Soviet governments, other parts of the world. But in Eastern Europe, Eisenhower allowed the Soviets to do as they pleased in their sphere of influence. The United States was committed to stopping the spread of communism, but the United States had no goal of overthrowing communist governments in Europe. To overthrow a government in Europe would invite war with the Soviet Union, and the United States was not interested in going to an all-out war over Europe or any other place. So this was a Cold War. Both sides used proxy conflicts like East Germany, like Hungary, to antagonize the other and to extend their influence and control. But neither side wanted a direct confrontation because that direct confrontation could set the whole world on fire.